So in today's edition of Useless or Genius, we're going to talk about SSD coolers and custom ones and whether or not they're actually necessary and work.
Hey, Jay. Jay. Jay.
What?
We got work to do.
Yeah, I'm playing World of Warships. Yeah. World of Warships is the free-to-play naval strategy game where you command the most iconic and famous warships from World War I and World War II, recreated with stunning detail and accuracy. Build your fleet while participating in various game types while upgrading your ship's arsenal along the way. New players who sign up using my link below will receive an exclusive starter pack to get you up and running quickly by receiving 7 days premium time, 1 million credits, 300 doubloons, and the Tier 5 premium ship, the Exeter. So what are you guys waiting for? Start sinking ships with World of Warships by heading to the description below and getting your freebies. So this is kind of a new series I've started called Useless or Genius, where we're kind of checking things to see whether or not they're useless or genius. The most recent one we did was actually the backplate cooler that we put on the GPU, and we're going to be retesting that actually, because a lot of you recommended that we remove the backplate entirely and just thermal pad the whole thing right to the back of the GPU. So we'll try that next. But today we're talking specifically about SSD coolers. This was an email I got when someone actually suggested, hey, can you tell us whether or not SSD coolers are better than just using the built-in one that comes on most motherboards, or just leaving it open and bare with no heatsink on there at all. So what we're gonna do today is we're gonna talk about this one. This is the HR10 2280 Pro Black from Thermalright. Thermalright's a brand that most of you should recognize. They make some of the most cost-efficient air coolers and AIOs now on the market. This one comes in 3 versions. I paid $25.90 on Amazon for this one. This is the black version, which has 2 heat pipes and a fan, so it's an active cooled SSD cooler. The 2280 Pro Silver, which is basically non-Cerakote. I'm pretty sure this is a Cerakote, it's not painted. People get that wrong all the time. It's just painted black. It's like, no, it's actually a Cerakote or potentially a ceramic coat, because otherwise paint will just insulate, but Cerakote allows the heat to transfer through it. But the bare metal one is $16.90, so it is $9 cheaper to not have it be black. So if you're just like, I don't care, I want the cooling aspect of it, I don't care if it's black or silver, you can get it for $16.90, which is actually a pretty good deal. Or you can get the HR10 2280 Non-Pro, which is a 2 heat pipe design as well. And it is a passive cooled, there is no fan on it whatsoever, and that is $11.59. So not an expensive investment, but it could be $11, $16, or $25 thrown down the drain if it doesn't actually do anything. So let's talk about SSDs for a second here. Depending on the capacity and the age of your drive, you may have chips or NAND chips and a controller on one side only, or you may have a controller and NAND chips on one side and more NAND chips on the other. Older drives tend to be the ones that are double-sided because they have less dense NANDs, which means they need more of them to get you the drive capacity. But now that we're dealing with chips that are 500 gigabytes per NAND pretty easily, this is a 1 terabyte drive, which means we're only utilizing the NAND right here. This is the NAND portion, one here, then we got some substrate in between, and then the controller is over here. Now the controller is typically the part that gets the hottest. The controller is also the part that is the most sensitive to heat because of the fact, depending on the workload, will determine how much work the controller is having to do. So obviously you have sequential, which means one big file moving from one spot to another, or reading and writing. Now writing is the part that actually puts the controller under the most, and the NAND as well, under the most heat conditions. Reading, it just is reading the data. It's pretty simple. But if you're doing random, or basically means it's searching for files all over the place and writing those files in a bunch of different places, that's a lot harder on the controller. So for our test, we're using IOmeter, which is a pretty neat utility. It's kind of a pain to set up at times, but anyway, it is running 32 workers, or threads, if you will, of full random 100% write 1 megabyte blocks. That is a lot of work for the controller to handle. The point here is not necessarily to test the write read or the write speed of the drive, because this is not a real world scenario test. This is not a situation most people would find themselves in with putting their controller and their drive under this much workflow or work task, if you will. But we needed to generate heat to see how well the coolers work. The 3 scenarios we'll be testing this is open, on the motherboard with no airflow over it whatsoever in front of the graphics card. So it's actually going to be on the lower slot on our Intel test bed behind me. Then we'll be running the unified cover that actually touches 3 different drives with this MSI board, but only 1 drive is installed. So it's just a big chunk of metal, essentially, that's going to spread the heat. Then we're going to install this cooler on there to see what happens to the temperatures. Now, when it comes to the drive speeds, obviously the controller has an upper limit or TJ max like any other SMD would. So as far as we know, it's 79 degrees is technically where the slowdown speed would be. However, the way that we have our test set up, we are fully utilizing the cache. So it is going to have a slowdown effect no matter what. Let's go ahead and now open the package and take a look, because I've already done the baseline test. I've already done the motherboard heatsink test. I need to now see how well this thing installs. And if it would even support a drive that has chips on both sides. And the reason why I say that is when you put the chips on the backside as well, you add about another 3 millimeters of height to the drive. So there's actually some scenarios where the drive may not fit in certain slots depending on the amount of clearance underneath it. Okay, so we get instructions for ants. So there's the 2 heat pipes right here. They are full length on both sides. And then you can see we have a fan right here, which is a pusher fan. Yes, it's a pusher fan that will be pushing air through the very center of the heatsink. Now there's a good chunk of the heatsink that is not going to have active airflow through it, simply because of the fact that the fan is recessed in there, as you can see, and it is in the very center. So only about less than 50% technically of this cooler is getting airflow through it. The problem with this though is if you're gonna use this on your motherboard and it's anything like our MSI where it has this big unified cover for all the SSDs, you have to remove that to use this, and then you have a board looking all plain. So this would make sense. Like up in the top slot, like the PCIe Gen 5 direct to CPU lanes or whatever, right above your GPU. But then the other thing is like, which way should you have the fan blowing? Should you have it blowing from the CPU side down towards the GPU? Because if you flip it and the GPU's right underneath it, and the GPU's under gaming load is putting off a ton of heat, then this would be picking up that heat and potentially adding heat to your drive if the drive isn't under loads. You'd be warming up your drive for no reason whatsoever. So I think personally it would make sense to have this fan pulling down from the CPU, blowing towards the GPU, so we're at least getting fresh air up here rather than any radiant heat right above the backplate. Gotta make sure you leave enough of it overhanging to be able to socket into your M.2 slot. Like if you put it all the way back flush, that's not gonna do you any good. So I would just center the drive on the cooler. I need to see right now though, do I need to take the... Oh, cool, okay. So I just realized the holes are elongated. So I can take the thermal pad off the bottom because heat does transfer 360 degrees. So heat will be going down through the PCB as well. Now, granted, this is not gonna do much in terms of cooling, but it allows me to at least, I guess, get the drive sort of centered on here. And then because the holes are oval, it means I can slide the cooler down, so obviously it's touching. So it's not like the holes are perfectly round, which limits the motion of where the cooler gets mounted. We can actually slide this down, and now we've sandwiched the cooler in there. So really easy install. I'd say the difficulty is like a 2 of 10. The hardest part would be for anyone, maybe, it'd probably be harder to install the SSD in your system than it would be to install this cooler. All right, it's not the world's smallest graphics card, it's actually a USB stick, but yeah, this is the world's smallest video card. Nope, just kidding. Okay, so there it is, obviously the Thermalright HR-10 Pro installed. So let's talk about whether or not it made a difference, shall we? The first chart we're taking a look at here is specifically the controller. That's the part that's most important to keep cool, because if you overheat it, it will absolutely start to throttle the read-write speeds of the drive to keep itself from cooking. So the light blue line right here is the test with no heatsink whatsoever, just the drive on the motherboard, no heatsink, no spreader, nothing. And as you can see, it starts off at just above 50C, and then it starts to climb and continues to climb until it reaches a 90C. Then it throttles itself slightly down to about 1200 megabytes per second, and then starts to come back up and dips and comes up again. This is not good. This drive being up into the mid 90s to 95C is bad. That is absolutely bad for the controller. It's doing the best it can to keep itself throttled, but the workflow that we've set up in IO meter is absolutely forcing it to continue to go. So this is, like I said, not a real life scenario. Your system would never be having the drive utilized to this degree. But we are doing a stress test in this nature to see if the cooler makes a difference. As you can see by the pink line, that is the motherboard heatsink installed, which is nothing more than a heat spreader. And interesting behavior, you can see these spikes in the middle of the chart. That is where the test actually kind of restarts itself. And when it restarts itself, it actually kind of clears that cache because it does a new data set. The cache spikes up, which makes the temp spike up. And then as soon as the cache is depleted, it drops down to about 1400 megabytes per second, and then does that a couple more times. So that's why you see those temperature spikes, because of the fact that the cache now is able to speed the drive up. And then as soon as the cache is utilized and the data set has exceeded the cache size, then we drop into the controller seeking specifically on the NAND to find the data. Or to write the data, I should say. But you can see we started a little bit lower on the temperature, just about 47 C, and then our spikes, the first one is just at 80, the second one is at about 85, and then the third one exceeds 85 by about 1 degree, and then the test ends after 15 minutes. But as soon as we put the HR-10 on there and put the fan at 100%, I'm telling you right now, it is probably the quietest fan ever. It is a 6,000 RPM fan, and it is very, 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 very quiet. So it's not like I had to get the mic over there, but it's not like those VRM fans that you find on some motherboards that are on the back by the IO that are just super whiny and loud and high pitched. Because I couldn't hear it, I just said, you know what? Max the damn fan out. So as you can see by these temperatures here, we started at 29 C. Because it's being actively cooled when it's not under load, so it can keep the temperature really low. So it starts at 29 C, and the first bit of the cache being utilized was going to about 7,000 megabytes per second, and it hits just under 40 C, and then we start to mellow out, and then the second time it restarts the test, or the second time it starts the test and utilizes the cache, we hit about 43 C, and then the second time it does it, it hit about 44 C, and then 44 C again. So it stayed very close to its idle speeds, and it stayed very flat. Now, say it again. Yeah. And it stays pretty close to its idle temperatures, and it's really, really flat versus these other curves doing crazy things. These other curves look weird because of the fact that the controller is doing things to keep itself from getting too hot. So even though with no heatsink whatsoever, it definitely got into thermal throttle range. Even with the motherboard heatsink on there, or heat spreader on there, it still gets, in my opinion, too hot for comfort. 86 C is too warm, in my opinion. And if we now take a look at the NAND temperature, the NAND temperature is the same story. It's just a lot less data points because it doesn't change temperature as dynamically as the controller would. So it follows the same sort of curve. Now the question is, what does that mean for speed? So if we take a look at the controller temperatures right here and we fade it to the background and we throw speed on top of that, or in terms of write in megabytes per second, you can see with the blue line, which is the zero heatsink installed on the drive whatsoever, it started off much, much slower. I mean, just under 3,300 megabytes per second, and then it kind of ramps up to about 4,500, and then it just gives up. That is because the temperature, if we look at the temperature curve, it actually hit 85 C, and then already it's in thermal throttle range, which is why it now drops all the way down to the 1,200 or so megabytes per second, and you can see it never recovers. The blue line never recovers because of the fact that the temperature never came down. So even when the test restarts, it was never able to even speed up to utilize the cache because the controller is overheating. So by the controller overheating means that it was never able to speed back up. If you look at the pink line, we've got several spikes during the test, and you can see exactly when the test restarts, and it even correlates with the additional temperature that you see on the controller, but it comes up over 7,000 megabytes per second and then utilizes the cache and then does it multiple times. And then the yellow line is the exact same story. We're getting the same speeds, but at a cooler temperature. Now you might be able to look at this data and say, well, the motherboard heatsink was able to give us basically the same speeds as the heatsink is able to, but even if you look at the baseline, you can see they're hovering right around the same 1,400 megabytes per second. But you know what? I think you would agree with me if you say keeping the temps as low as possible is never a bad thing. So where would you use this? Well, it would be pretty obvious if you're using any sort of motherboard like this right here. This is a B650 board. It is a terrible value. It's actually the one we bought to use on our NAS, and then we decided it was pretty bad and switched out the board. But check this out. We've got a 2280 right here, and we got a 2280 right here, but we have no coolers on them whatsoever. Now, you'd want to make sure, especially if you're using a system drive for NVMe, having some sort of heat spreader on there at bare minimum is necessary. In fact, that's what we've kind of decided is most of the motherboards, if you look at them, the first slot has a big, thick chunker cooler on it. But then all the other drives tend to have less. And the reason for that is an OS drive is doing a lot more in the background. It's moving files around constantly, page files, programs running in the background, seeking, needing files. So the OS drive is going to be usually under much more heat or constant use, which means the heat is going to be higher on that. In fact, if we look at hardware info right now, my drive right here, which is my crucial drive, is actually idling at about 44C. But depending on what I'm doing, loading programs in the background, it can jump up as high as 58C, as you can see right here. Now that wasn't any sort of throttle range, but keeping that drive as cool as possible would be nice. Now, would I recommend removing a big chonker of a heat spreader for this active drive? Well, I think that depends on one, what kind of drive it is, how fast is the drive capable of going, and what are you doing with your system? If you're using a drive that is constantly moving big files, let's say it's a scratch drive for editing or video editing, or you're moving big files for Photoshop or whatever, it would probably be beneficial to have an actively cooled drive like this. That way you can keep the controller as cool as possible so that you can maintain those speeds as long as possible. But it might be more, you might be more limited by the cache size of your drive. Now, not all cache sizes on drives are equal. They're not a guaranteed percentage. Like for instance, crucial drives tend to have an abnormally large cache. In fact, our 2 terabyte crucial drive that's on here has a 750 gigabyte cache. That is a big percentage of our drive that is cache, of our 2 terabyte drive. But once you utilize the cache and it drops, it's much slower than these other drives when they run out of cache and drop. So where they bottom out at is not equal either. So you need to do your research on the drive. What gen drive is it? What is the controller type? What is the cache size? What is the behavior of the speed after the cache has been saturated? And those are going to have a bigger effect on your overall performance, honestly, than something like an active cooler versus a passive cooler found on your motherboard. But if you're running a motherboard like this, where it has maybe a heat spreader on the top slot, which would be usually your system drive because it's direct lanes to the CPU, if you have secondary drives on there that are not covered, then it could be beneficial to have those covered. Some sort of airflow is going to be important though. Because look at this right here. One thing we didn't do is I made sure that the fans didn't run during the test because I didn't want the fan pulling air through the drive, because that could have also given us a different result. If this drive is on the backside and it's pulling up, picking up warm air from the GPU, our nice cool idle temp right now of, 32C, temperature 3 is the controller, of 32C might be a higher idle because of the fact that if you're gaming and you're putting warm air through it, it could be having the warm air affect its idle temperatures, which would affect the starting temps, which could affect your overall performance of the drive. So there's a lot more involved here than just throwing a heatsink on a drive and saying, yes, it does or doesn't work. But I think what we can take away from this, if your motherboard does not have any sort of active heatsink or passive heatsink on it for your drive, get something on there. But I think if we were to talk about the big chunking, I say chunkers, they're really just chunks of metal that go on top of the drive. Those always get the job done. For instance, my crucial drive here, when I did this test with its base, can I even pop this off right now? Is it a toolless? I think it is a toolless. Let's see. Yeah. So this guy right here, this is what is on the OS drive on this particular board. It is not actively cooled. It has a little bit of a heat sinking value to it. It's got a heat pad or a thermal pad on there, and it's warm right now. In fact, by taking that off, is my drive temp going up? Yeah, 48 or 49. Now, would I replace this with that active cooler? Probably, to be honest. One, it looks cool. It's actually not a bad looking design. It's $25. It's not a terrible spend. I would absolutely put it on a drive I have on the board that is not cooled by any sort of passive cooler. But as you can see, my temperatures continue to go up. I'm at 51, 52, and it's not doing anything right now. I would probably throw it on there, to be honest, if I wanted the maximum performance and the coolest temperatures possible. But if you're concerned about cost, get the non-black one. You would then save $9 and it'd be $16. Is $16 worth the peace of mind of knowing your drive is running as cool as it possibly can? Now, because this is on the front side of the GPU, if the GPU fan was running, it would help pull more air through it and probably would have even had better temperatures. But if it's on the back side of the GPU, it could have the adverse effect. Now, putting warm air over this would probably be better than letting this just passively radiate, because the warm air with movement is going to have more thermal capacity to it than convection dealing, with being in charge of cooling. Having heat radiate away from this is going to be a very slow, very weak force versus, now that's radiation, right? Convection would be the force of the heat moving and the speed at which it moves away. Having any sort of airflow over this would be better than nothing. So there's a lot of buts when it comes to installing these. It really comes down to the price. I don't think $16 for the silver one's a bad spend. I think charging $9 extra for black's a little excessive, 5 maybe, 20, making it 20, 21 bucks. But absolutely a good spend if you have a board like this where you have no coolers on it whatsoever, especially for the OS drive. Your OS drive needs some sort of cooling. There you go, take that as you will. I'll put the link to this down in the description below. Thermalright's doing some awesome stuff in my opinion. I mean, they have come out with air coolers that are disrupting the industry. They have come out with AIOs at an insanely low price, disrupting the industry. And now they're just moving on to these other things. It still boggles my mind that they can make something like this in mass production and still only cost 26 or 25 bucks, 25.90, and still make money on it. It's not bad. All right, guys, sound off down below if you think this is worth it. And sound off with any other devices you think we should be doing tests on to decide whether or not it's useless or genius. All right, guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. So as you can see here, my system drive is continuing to climb 50, but check this out. If I put the heatsink back on there, it actually had climbed to about 54. I know you can't see it there. That was 58 when it was doing some other stuff. Watch how fast it goes down when I put the heatsink back on. So here it is right there, 52, 51. There we go. 50, 49, 48, 49, 48, 46, 45, 44, 43. That's not an active cooler. That's just a chunk of metal with a heat pad on it. Look, the GPU fans aren't even turning. There's no active airflow whatsoever over that. So, heat sinks are important for your drives.